Okay, so I'm going to carry on from where I left off last time, which was talking about Aristotle's inductive method, moving from particulars to universals. You remember I contrasted this with Plato's theory of forms. Now, moving from particular instances to universal principles, well, this seems quite a sciencey thing to do, and this reflects Aristotle's sort of scientific upbringing and background. So just a few kind of background facts. He was born in 3.iv.b, and his dad was a personal surgeon to Amyntas, the king of Macedon, Amyntas would go on to become the grandfather of Alexander the Great. Now, Aristotle moved to Athens at age 18, and he studied in Plato's academy, which was probably the greatest place of learning in the world at that time. After that, he took a short excursion to the Isle of Lesbos to study the local flora and fauna of the island, and he did a lot of interesting biological work there. Incidentally, the Isle of Lesbos is related to the term lesbian, which is due to one of Lesbos' most famous residents in ancient Greek times, Sappho, who wrote who's a poetess who wrote many female love poems. After his sort of interesting sojourn on Lesbos, he was called back by none other than Philip II of Macedon, who was the son of Amyntas, to teach Philip's own son, who would go on to become Alexander the Great in 343 BC, and then he returned to Athens shortly after that and set up his own school, the Lyceum. I imagine Alexander was quite an unruly pupil, and it was nice to have some sort of more chilled students in his Lyceum. And then after that, he was exiled from Athens shortly before his death due to anti-Macedonian sentiment, and he died shortly after that in 322 BC. So we've talked about Aristotle's deductive background, his scientific upbringing, but he also had another form of reasoning, which is the inductive method. And this is the famous Aristotelian logic, which is laid out in 6 books known as the Organon, or the Instrument. And the area of Aristotle's logic I'm going to talk about is probably his most famous. It's something called the syllogism. Now, syllogism is quite a scary word, and I'm going to kind of try to break it down a bit. So it's a way of using 2 premises to deduce a conclusion, i.e. you have 2 sentences, and the relationship between 2 sentences is such that you can get a self-evident third sentence out of it. So kind of, in terms of what a premise is, Aristotle believed that there were 2 parts to every sentence. There was a subject, which would tend to be a noun, so say like a cat, and there would be a predicate. Now, predicate's also a scary word, but that tends to be just easiest to think of as an attribute. So say, has a tail. So a cat, the subject, has a tail, which is the predicate. And there's sort of potentially 4 different relationships you can have in terms of premises, with depending on whether the subject's universal or not. So you could have all cats have tails, some cats have tails, some cats don't have tails, and no cats have tails. So there's these 4 things, and I'm sure you can probably tell that some of these are mutually exclusive. For instance, you can't have all cats having tails and no cats having tails. And Aristotle, not being stupid, picked up on this as well, and he thought this would make a good form of reasoning. So he's kind of comes up with this sort of reasoning, and I think a good example would be his syllogism, which is commonly used in philosophy textbooks. All men are mortal, which is premise 1. Socrates is a man, which is premise 2. And therefore the conclusion to be drawn is Socrates is mortal. Now, there's kind of 3 errors around syllogism, which I'm going to dig into, and this is partly why it's not used very often in modern logic. So the first error to set out is that the syllogism is more to do with the actual relation to the world rather than an error in the formal mechanics of the syllogism. So this is that it's assumed that not all terms are empty, i.e. there's some relation to something in the real world. Otherwise you can end up with a conclusion that's logically sound but in no way correlates to reality. For example, premise 1, all golden mountains are mountains. Premise 2, all golden mountains are golden. And you can draw the conclusion, some mountains are golden. Well, if you guys find a golden mountain out there, I want to know, and I want to get my cut of the gold. that, as you can see, logically valid doesn't necessarily correlate to the real world. A second error is this assumption of all. It's a tremendously big assumption to make. Just to highlight that, in the sentence, all men are mortal, that would just make this absolutely 100% true. This would have required you to have observed everything that could have been called a man since the start of the universe, and observed that, it has died. And even then you won't be able to prove it because some men are still living, so they've not all been proved to be mortal. So concepts such as all rely on you to make an inference, and an inference is potentially weakness in the argument. And then the third error is one that's not directly related to Aristotle himself. It's more related to some of the medieval scholastics who came after Aristotle. So the scholastics were these sort of monk-type dudes in the Middle Ages who would live in monasteries, study lots of old texts, including the work of Aristotle. And one of their errors is can be set out as follows. So you've got, I previously said that you could have the conclusion, some cats have tails, and that would also enable you to draw the conclusion, if it's not the case that all cats have tails, that some cats don't have tails. Now, that's the way it would seem to work, but you could also have it and put it in a different way that would be invalid. So, for example, some men are not Greeks, but then the opposite of that would then be some Greeks are not men. Now, the Greeks may have been many weird and wonderful things, but I think it's very hard to argue that they were not men. And the error in this case is due to a translation issue between Greeks and... Now, Aristotle was a Greek dude and he wrote in Greek, but in Latin there's an issue around the use of the words non and no being the same, and this resulted in the logicians at the time putting this forward in a positive sense. So, for example, some cats don't have tails, rather than not every cat has a tail, which is the way Aristotle puts it forward. And by putting it forward in the positive sense, you can get this weird inversion, which is completely invalid. So, Aristotle's inductive method is probably less influential in the modern day than his deductive method is less influential in the modern day than his inductive method, but it's still important to learn because it had a massive effect on thought throughout the Middle Ages and quite close to the present day, indeed, in the 19th century. It was only in the 19th century, with the work of Frege and mathematical logic, that he was really recognised to have been superseded. Thanks for listening.